Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. Every donation is helpful, and every donation is appreciated. Thank you. Don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. Previous guests on the show have included Michael Frost, Drew Hyun, and Danielle Ripley Burgess. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Mark Baker. Mark is professor of mission and theology at Fresno Pacific Biblical. He previously was a missionary in Honduras for 10 years. His latest book, Centered Set Church, Discipleship and Community Without Judgmentalism, is the topic of our conversation today. Enjoy the conversation and discover how we can be a community oriented to and oriented around Jesus at the center. Here's Mark. Mark, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for hopping on.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Yeah. So I love your book, Centered Set Church, and the principles in there are really fascinating for me, and I think it's something we need to get to the church. I'd love to start a little bit back in your story in Honduras, and how did your time in Honduras affect you and your viewpoint on church, Jesus, maybe evangelism? What did that look like for you?
Thank you. Well, that's a great question. So let me say a couple things, and then I'll bring it into the Centered Set Church discussion, the way it affected me. So I got out of college, graduated from college, went to Honduras, and I would say a fairly typical, mainstream evangelical. And then I'm in this situation of extreme poverty, and started asking lots of questions. And what does my faith have to do with this? And in a certain sense, became maybe, disgruntled would be too hard, but to say, sort of a shift away from my evangelistic kind of focus and more into action of caring for people's needs. But over time in Honduras, what I found happening was, as I more and more encountered people and got into their lives and encountered ways that they were suffering under the weight of religious legalism and the weight of a concept of God as an angry, accusing figure, that then combined with that legalism, it was toxic. And so over time, what I felt was that, I'm still, to this day, active in alleviating poverty, concerns about justice. But over time, I became, what I most wanted to talk about was Jesus and invite people to meet Jesus, because I had a sense of, their physical situation matters, but even if we fix their leaky roof, if they're living with this toxic theology and under the weight of this religious legalism, I found myself more and more, back to an evangelistic focus, although, I would say with a fuller, richer sense of why I was doing that. So in that sense, experientially in Honduras was very significant for my own personal development. But now an interesting thing for as far as Centered Set Church and how even I start the book is I myself grew up in a pretty legalistic setting, but I thought that I had left legalism behind. Well, I did. I sort of moved away from the rules. And even, when I'm in Honduras, I'm always just, these people, why are they talking about, not going to movies and this kind of stuff. But, my early years in Honduras, I was as judgmental or more so than I had been in my, legalistic years. So, and this, I didn't see it at the time, but looking back, I came to realize, I had just shifted, one way of drawing a line and seeing myself as superior to others, which in my youth had been, don't drink, smoke, dance, swear, etc. And now it had been, are you helping the poor? or even argue legalistic. Like, I looked sort of judgmentally at these Honduran churches that were so legalistic. And then that is really what propelled me into the work on Centered Set Church, because I realized, in part through studying Galatians with the church in Honduras, that we needed some way of talking about this that was broader than just legalism, because there's this underlying judgmentalism, this underlying sense of superiority, and this still underlying weight of, and when I felt this myself, I was still trying so hard to be a good Christian, to measure up to my own new categories of what that meant. So that's some of the ways that my experience there was influential and play into this book.
Yeah, that's helpful. I heard George Patterson train. He spent many years in Honduras.
Yes.
One of the things that he does this little thing that he used to do, where he talks about the actual care for the poor and providing for needs and meeting people's needs are one wing of an eagle, and the evangelistic Jesus, like, you need some spirituality, you need some faith, is another wing of the eagle. And if you just have one of those wings, you're going to fly in a circle. You're not actually going to move forward. And we need both, right? We need to actually care for the poor, the marginalized. We need to help, and we need to bring them to an encounter with Jesus, so that they can move into a different realm and different possibility. And I think that's, part of what you were able to find as you're journeying through Honduras.
Yes.
So if we're going back into Centered Set Church, give us frame it for us. What does that look like? Paul Hebert talked a little bit about the centered set versus bounded set. And for you, so what are you trying to do in this book, and what are some of these definitions that you're starting with so that you could frame our conversation?
Yeah, thank you. So, and I would invite listeners to go to centeredsetchurch.com. So maybe, hit pause as you're listening to this, because this is a very visual, diagram oriented things. And so on that website, centeredsetchurch.com, if you go down to the second segment, there's a free PDF there that has diagrams of what I'm going to talk about right now. So hit pause, get that, come back and join us. So I want to pick up just where I was talking about myself. And if you remember, I said, I was drawing lines. And so a bounded set, and again, thank Joshua for giving credit to Paul Hebert, because I'm borrowing this from him. And everyone else who talks about this is as well. So a bounded set, and I'll go right to churches. So a bounded church is one that draws a line, a circle, and it defines who belongs by the people's orientation relationship with that line. And so if you fulfill what the line is, so for me as a youth, it was, this list of things not to do and to do. And then later it was, I'm in churches that, are you helping the poor? Even as I said, are you not legalistic? So I was in a church in Honduras that we were proudly not legalistic, but we had drawn a line. We were a circle. And so you use that circle to define who is in and who is out. And it lends itself to judgmentalism. Yeah. So that's a bounded group, a line that defines who belongs. So in reaction to that, some people appropriately say, this judgmentalism is horrible, the shame that flows from this. We've got to get rid of it. So what do? Well, then erase the line. And then what you get is what Hebert calls a fuzzy set or a fuzzy church. And it is, and I think it's important to view these things, on a continuum. So they're expressions of the same dynamic, and one has the line, the other doesn't. So a fuzzy church has no line that defines who belongs. And so it takes care of the judgmentalism problem, but it brings in other issues. So then it's hard to have a sense of identity because, well, what are we? And in essence, what you are is not bounded. And it's very hard to even talk about conversion because there's not like a definition of who we are, the sense of crossing, joining in. And so Hebert thankfully offered a third option, which is a totally different paradigm. So it's not on the continuum. It's a totally different way of answering the question, who belongs, who's part of us, who is a Christian in our midst. And this is a centered set. And so what it does is it answers the question, not by drawing a line and saying, are you on this side of the line or that side of the line, but by looking at someone's orientation towards the center. And so as Hebert says, someone could be very distant from the center and not look like, much of a Christian at all, but they have turned, they've repented. They've turned towards Jesus, the center. They're heading towards the center. Then you say, okay, that's part of us. And but now in contrast to a fuzzy group, a centered set church has ways of defining who belongs, and it still has a sense of standards, convictions, beliefs. And so what you're looking at are for people who are oriented towards the center. And as you see in the diagram, those are arrows going towards the center. And the people whose arrows are not going toward the center are not part of the group. They're oriented towards something else. Their life focus is on something else. So bounded and fuzzy, two extremes of the same continuum, and then centered set, a fully different way of defining who belongs to the group by direction, by orientation, rather than being on one side of a line or another.
Yeah, that's so helpful, and it helps no matter where people are at or how far away we think somebody is at towards the center, which hopefully is Jesus, that they can actually orient themselves there. And they say, okay, we're on this journey together as you're orienting yourself. And so that's really helpful in a sense to have these centered sets. Have you seen a correlation, not just in the church, but in culture as a whole? As I hear you define some like a fuzzy church, it seems like our culture is moving towards not just a bounded set. We're actually a fuzzy culture. We don't really know how to define ourselves anymore. We basically define ourselves however we want to, and there's not really an in-group or an out-group, or there's not really a center. Have you seen the correlation between the two?
Yes. And I'd say, not just that we corporately have a fuzziness, but then that boils down into, interpersonal relationship, that such a strong sense of hesitancy of, who am I to tell you, how to act, how to live. It's, hey, whatever for you. Even I use the term in the book, whateverism. So and on that note, I only, coming out of the Honduran context, what I'd encountered there was the problem of bounded churches. And so for years, all I talked about was bounded and centered. But over time, I noticed in my students here at the seminary where I teach, Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary, that I was encountering more and more, fuzziness. Although, I wasn't using the term, but, a stronger sense of relativism that they were bringing with them from society, and a hesitancy to say to someone else like, oh, that's off base. And so then I started talking about fuzzy in class, and it's actually been very helpful, both because more and more students are now saying to me, oh yeah, actually I'm recognizing our church has been becoming increasingly fuzzy. And also it helps because then I think there were people that were nervous about leaving a bounded group has a sense of seriousness about it. Like we take belief seriously, we take ethics seriously. And so then when I would talk about centered, people would get nervous because they don't want to, they felt like they were letting go of something serious. But what I observe now is when I talk about bounded and then fuzzy, and people recognize, oh yeah, he doesn't like fuzzy, which I don't. Then when I talk about centered, then together we can say, yeah, the problem is fuzziness. Like we're both don't want to be fuzzy, but centered is not fuzzy. So I think it's very helpful and important societally today to talk about fuzzy.
Yes, it's good. But so then how then can we not be fuzzy, and how can we define a center, find a center, and be a centered people?
So, okay, so so in my book, mostly what I advocate for is the importance of having a center, and in contrast to fuzzy. And I think defining the center for a church is of utmost importance. So, I mean, if you noticed in our conversation right now, I said, center is Jesus. And so, I would hope that as Christians, followers of Jesus, we could all agree Jesus Christ is our center. But then after that, how to define, I think it's going to be very different depending on your tradition, your church, whether you're, an independent church, you're part of a denomination that's, fairly structured like Presbyterian, or, less structured Baptist or something. So I actually don't give direction on how in your individual setting to define a center, but acknowledge it's very important, and it's going to be different, and it will be more than Jesus, right? I mean, that's the thing. So I can say we do this corporately, but like in the book, I say for some churches, infant baptism is part of their center, and for others, adult baptism is. And so it's important for you as a church to define what that is, why that is. And I think both can be centered. I'm not the one to tell you, it needs to be this or the other.
So now if we have a center, and the church has defined a center, and we're there, it's around Jesus, and then our other principles that we want to define it as, how does that affect the way that we interact with the people in our community, or what we would say in a bounded set outside of our community? How can we interact between the two?
Okay, so that's a really good question. And part of what I get at in the book is these paradigms, these concepts, they have power. And so in a bounded church, you can say, we're going to really work at being welcoming. We want people to feel welcome and not judged. We want to bring them in. But I would argue that, the boundedness, the character of your boundedness is going to trip you up. It's going to seep out, and people are going to feel it. And in the same way, a centered church, hopefully they would say the same thing. Let's work at being welcoming. But the paradigm itself will change your stance towards outsiders. And here's a key thing that I think listeners could feel is in a bounded church, where is my security? My security is in the line. That's what is defining me as being a good Christian. That's what defines me as being part of this group. And so there is a natural tendency to guard the line, to protect the line. And those of us who have been in bounded churches, I'm sure as you're listening, you can identify with this sense of even, talking about someone does something, believes something wrong, does something wrong. And there's this sense of, well, we need to do something. And part of the reason we're doing something is because we have to keep this standard. We have to, take this seriously. Okay. And that's what, I think people pick up on is this line. They feel it in us. Whereas in a centered church, where's my security? My security is in the center. And that's not just a Christian statement. My center is Jesus, which a bounded church can say that as well. But if you're in a centered dynamic, your security literally is in the center. That's what the church is focused on. And that's how it's defining who we are, is by looking at orientation. So what that means is then when I'm meeting with people on the outside, I'm not as nervous. I'm not as uptight about these boundary line issues, because we as a group we can deal with having some people amongst us that are a bit messy.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't affect my reputation, my security, because my security is in the center. So I think the dynamics themselves lead to the dynamic of the center church leads to having a more relaxed, less judgmental stance towards outsiders, even if you're not, sort of talking, strategizing about it. I think that the dynamic itself will help in that direction.
Yeah, as we're secure in our center, one of the things as you're talking, it just actually, I thought that when we're interacting with outsiders, one of the things we would be doing is helping people encounter the center more than give people information on how they could be in or out, where we define our line. So it's a difference between information and encounter of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where, going back to my story, I started out in Honduras doing evangelism that was, a packet of information that I had grown up with and used and wasn't all bad, right? I mean, I'm not trashing, 15 years of, pre-centered set church ministry. But what happened, then I came to, I want people to meet Jesus because they had this, such distorted view of God. And so I want them, no, that's not who God is. Let's come to Jesus and let Jesus shape the way we view it, God. So in a similar way, I think in a centered church, it is, we're bringing people to Jesus, not just do these few things to get across the line.
Right. And so in your research, as you're talking to people that are centered churches, what are some examples of how people are doing that?
Yeah. So, and on that note, I want to make a little bit, just make a book plug here of like what's distinct about this book. And so I am hardly the only one talking about bounded centered churches. Like you can Google that and find, podcasts, chapters and books, blogs, sermons. But there wasn't a resource out there that talked about how to actually live this out. And my students had asked me questions of, what do you do about church membership? Or, there's this person in my church that's doing this. How do I deal with it in a centered way? And there was no resource I could point them to. So what I did was I went out and interviewed over 40 people who in various churches that were working at living out this centered approach. And so, about half, maybe more, 2/3 of the book is how to live this out. So some things I found, and a note here too, I sort of thought that I would go out and sort of get case studies and then have, okay, this is the centered way to do membership. And this is the centered way to deal with, a couple who aren't married living together. And this is the centered way to deal with someone who's, talking about some doctrinal belief that's not in line with yours. But what I quickly found was there's not a centered way of doing things, because I would hear stories from leaders talking about the same situation, and they approached it differently. They did it differently. So, and I have lots of examples in the book. So, there are examples of people dealing with that. And I have a chapter or a section of a chapter on church membership. And I have, examples from 3 different churches of how they do it. So the examples are in there. But what I found was it's character and characteristics. So, which there's a chapter I talk about the qualities of Jesus. So what I found was churches that were centered, they're working with, compassion, curiosity. So, something is wrong in someone's life, they're off. In a bounded group, it's just, hey, you're on the wrong side of the line. Yeah, we got to do something. But at a centered, then they're asking the why questions, like what's going on? So not just, we see this, but well, why? What's going on? Let's dig deeper. And then creativity. How do we respond to this situation? What's the most loving way for the person, for the community? How do we orient them towards the center? Creating a context, an environment of safety so that people feel they can talk about their things and trust in humility, trust in God, that that God will work in people's lives. So I'm not sure if I don't remember exactly the question. So re-ask it again if that wasn't.
No, I think that's really helpful, because one of the things is you're talking about is that how do we actually interact with people when we want to actually point them towards Jesus, help them encounter Jesus. You're talking about compassion, curiosity, creativity. If you're talking about these characteristics, that's really helpful for people to grab a hold of, rather than this is the set 1, 2, 3 way.
Yes.
And I think it's the same thing where, the set 1, 2, 3 way is like, here's the line. We don't want to, you could be in or out, right? Mm-hmm. So these characteristics are really important. And I think part of curiosity, what that does is that I think it helps people feel like they're not judged, right? When for example, if I'm in a discipleship group. So I remember when I was in a senior in high school, I was in a discipleship group. There was, 3 other guys, and we had a mentor, and I confessed my sin. I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. I was doing something wrong. And I didn't get any curiosity. I didn't get any questions of why. All I got was a look like, you're not in the group right now. Like, you are not in our line. Like, you need to go back and cross this line, or else we don't want to be around you. And it actually disempowered me from being a part of that community. I didn't want to be a part of that community anymore, because I felt like I was shunned and I was shamed into something, instead of being asked why. Why did that happen? And then that actually could reorient me to the center, but it didn't happen that way.
That's a great example.
And so for me, I felt a toxic shame, right? Mm-hmm. I felt like I couldn't be a part of that. But you talk a little bit about reintegrative shame in your book, as opposed to disintegrative shame. Mm-hmm. And I think, a little disintegrative shame.
Yes.
But as a culture, we with Brené Brown and talking about eliminating shame, we think shame is all bad. But Jesus used shame to integrate people. How did you see that in a centered way?
Yeah. So, and this goes back to my previous book that I co-authored with Jason Georges. And one of the things we wrestled with there is, and so you're thinking about, in a context of mission, in an honor shame culture, or a context where honor and shame is more pronounced. And Jason especially had very strong convictions of challenging that sense that shame is always bad. And my line about it was, there are things that are shameful. Even going back to your story, it's not to say, oh, what you did, no, there's no shame in that. It very well may have been something that is shameful, but then there's 2 general ways of responding to a shameful thing. So things are shameful, but is the intent of the community to restore the person, or is it to you said shun, or to in some way label them, to put the focus on they have become bad, damaged, etc. And so I think very clearly Jesus practiced reintegrative shaming. And I think this in both ways. And so you think there were times, and it could sound harsh if you just think shaming is always bad, but Jesus at times shamed people. I mean, I think of, when Jesus was in the house of Simon the Pharisee,
Mm-hmm.
he said, since the time I came in, you did not, no, since I came, you did not wash my feet. You did not greet me with a kiss. But since the time I've come in, this woman has been bathing my feet. She has done this. I mean, that is a shaming move towards Simon. So there are times when Jesus actively shamed, but it's reintegrative. He didn't then, he could have gone on much worse and said, and how is someone like you in this town even doing this kind of thing? This is ridiculous. I'm out of here. So he is seeking to bring Simon in. But then also reintegrative shaming, Jesus repeatedly is with people who have done shameful things, even in that moment with this woman who's crying at his feet.
Yeah.
But what's he do is he seeks to restore them, bring them back into the community, tax collectors and sinners.
Yeah.
I have in the book, actually in both books, the Honor Shame book and Centered Set Church, I work with Luke 15 and the father in the parable of the prodigal son as an example of this, as reintegrating this. The intention is to bring both sons back into relationship. So, and I think, in Galatians 2, 6:1, Paul says, those of you who are spiritual, so to confront the sin, but to restore, to bring them in with kindness, with gentleness. And again, I think that is much more possible in a centered church because there is emotional space for us to say to the teenage Joshua, to say, okay, what's going on? Why is this? Because we don't have to immediately get, oh no, what about our line? So
yeah, that's very helpful. That's good. And we're getting to this place, even in America, we're getting very multicultural, and we're interacting a lot with people, from guilt, innocence, culture background, from honor, shame backgrounds. How can we actually be centered and integrate different worldviews and thoughts about, guilt, innocence, honor, shame, in a centered set?
Okay. That's a big question.
That is a big question.
Let me think of a couple short responses. So first of all, thinking, in an honor shame culture, or for people from that, no, let me start the other side. So we could talk about honor shame cultures or guilt innocence cultures, but shame is everywhere, right? So it's whether I am, as individualistic, guilt innocent as possible, I still experience shame. And so in that sense, I think it is, of much greater importance in an honor shame culture to be talking about the gospel in terms of shame. But I think anywhere to preach sermons that are to do Bible studies, pastoral counseling that is shame releasing is a positive thing and should be part of a centered church. A significant difference between shame issues in a guilt innocent culture and an honor shame culture is that in an honor shame context, it's more strongly a collective sense. It's our shame. So it's not, so for me, individualistic, like it's about me. What are people going to think of me? But in an honor shame or an honor shame culture, it'd be much more likely, what are people going to think of my family, my tribe, my country? So that corporate thing. So, okay. So now to an honor to centered set church, then I think in the honor shame context, it is yeah, very much overlapping. And then whether you're bounded or centered, if you're in an honor shame context, it's about, the group definition. But and that's where I think, it's very important. Like, group identity is important. So we're not saying, oh, this whole thing of, this group being so intent about who's in and who's out and who they are. No, we just want to give them different tools, ways of thinking about that, which has space for, as I said before, a bit more messiness. So I think in the guilt innocence, individually centered set church is very important because it enables dealing with shame in a less toxic way. And I think in an honor shame culture, centered set is very important for that reason, but also for enabling a community, a group to be able to still have standards of what's honorable, but to do it in a less, in a less toxic, judgmental, or disintegrative shaming kind of way. But I don't know. What do you think? You have more experience than I do.
Well, one of the things I want to know is how, in this, is we're working together in this multicultural setting. And in an honor shame culture, people are really, they don't want to shame the group. So say as a leadership team in an organization, they don't want to shame the organization. So if somebody does something that is shameful, that needs to be reoriented towards the center, some of it, they're going to, if they're in honor shame, they're going to say, I am going to protect the image of the organization at all costs. And so we actually don't want to talk about the shame. We don't want to talk about how we're going to reorient somebody. Sometimes we even want to just cut off the shame and let them go, and so that we can protect this organization. I think if an organization wants to be healthier and be centered on Jesus, there has to be some talk. So I may be coming from a Western worldview, guilt innocence, that we need to actually talk about the shame so that we as a community, an organization, can move forward towards the center ourselves. And if we don't talk about it, we may be fuzzy. We may not know how to get back to the center, and we may veer off course for a long time.
Yeah, as you're talking, it's I think another element in this is that what is honorable gets redefined as Jesus followers and as a centered set church. So again, I was just thinking of, Paul in this tension in Galatians with these, Jewish Christians who are showing up in Galatia telling, no, we need to be doing these Jewish practices. And notice that Paul doesn't get into arguments about the practices themselves. He doesn't say, oh, no, it's not circumcision. It's this, it's, tithes and offerings. But what he gets at is, this is not who we are in Jesus. It's not, this is my language, but it's not this in-out game. So what becomes honorable? So the other leaders, they're still, they're in an honor shame context, and they're what I would say working with a bounded paradigm. Yeah. And so their definition of what's honorable is doing these appropriate behaviors. Now, Paul isn't necessarily even against those behaviors, but what he's against is using those behaviors to judge others. So I think in in people from honor shame contexts, we need to be in a centered set church. We need to be working at redefining what is honorable. And part of what is honorable is not playing, one-upmanship games, not viewing ourselves as competitive, but recognizing in Jesus, through Jesus, in God's family, that's what brings us together, because the sense of the in and outness and defining the lines and definitions of our group is a very, very strong thing. So I think
it's true.
A challenge to that. We can have our security in something else, and we are called to live in a countercultural way.
Yeah, that's good. I really like that. Is there anything that really surprised you while doing your research for this book?
Yes. This came to my mind immediately. And maybe as I'm talking, I'll think of something else. But so one thing, over the years when I've talked about bounded and centered, a common thing that people would say to me is, I really like centered, but there are times where you have to be bounded. And so common examples they would say was in like maybe in children's ministry, or because of their, stages of learning, or, recovery ministry. Like with addiction, you just have to be bounded with people. So I knew in my book, if I was going to have a compelling argument, I needed to have a centered example of recovery ministry. So I found someone here in Fresno through a former student who was involved in recovering ministry and was passionate about centered approach. And so what I want you to feel here is how I'm entering into this discussion. So I'm needing to show that centered works as well as bounded in recovery, addiction kind of ministry. So that's what I'm thinking. So I sit down with the interview, hoping for that. Like, I need something to show that this works as well. And and this is in the book, Dave Obwal, and he starts talking to me, and he is so passionate about the centered approach that it is not at all that, oh yeah, Mark, I can show you how it's as good. He starts talking about, I did it in a bounded way. And now the centered way is so much better. And so I was surprised, right? And I'm the centered set advocate, but here's this guy that is showing me is going beyond my expectations, not just that it's good, like this is much better. So that was, a moment of surprise. And then I think, not shocking surprise, but what I already mentioned, that sense of, oh, there is great diversity in ways of doing things in a centered way. That was a bit of reorientation for me in doing the book. Then I would just say, lots of little surprises just in listening to people's stories that were very encouraging.
So if somebody is listening and say, oh, I actually want to take a step towards becoming more centered than we are as an individual, as a community, as a church, what are some steps you think that people should take to orient themselves towards center? Okay,
so first of all, I think it's, and I appreciate the way you asked the question. I think it's very important that an individual cannot do this on their own. So, if I'm the pastor or I'm the leader of the small group, you can't just read my book and then say, okay, I'm going to do this, because you need a shared understanding. And I would say shared language is very helpful. So one step is to bring others on board to understanding these concepts and give shared language. And that's that is the reason, in addition to writing the book, I made a series of 5 15-minute videos, because I'm recognizing, of course, I love everyone to read the book, but not everyone's going to read the book.
Right.
So if you're in a small group, a church, some ministry, and the people, you have people that aren't going to read the book or don't want to read the book, then you could use these videos as a way of bringing people along in the basics. And they're on, again, centeredsetchurch.com. So that's one thing I would say. I would highlight the importance of shared language, share these conceptions, so you can refer to it. Secondly, I think a very key significant thing is going back to your early question, the center is the God of the center. So you could use lots of, techniques, examples, ways of dealing things from the book.
Yeah.
But if people's concept of God is an accusing, judgmental, finger pointing figure, you're not going to be a centered church.
Yeah.
Because to use it in this terminology, if the God of the center is a bounded church God, you're going to have a bounded church.
Yeah.
And that's why, in the book, I have a chapter on the God of the center, because I think it's very key to not just, put up the diagrams and talk about these things, but work at making sure that the God revealed by Jesus Christ is the God that people in the community have in mind for this centered approach to work. So those, I would say, would be two foundational things. And then, maybe one other thing that comes to mind is to be in conversation with others as you do things. So, and this impressed me in talking to people. I did interviews. They would say, they would hit a situation, and whether it's, dealing with debates in the church about worship, or dealing with, here's a person who has sinned, or how are we going to handle this? To stop and say, okay, how do we do this in a centered way?
Yeah.
So not just say, okay, let's be centered and go work on it, but regularly, continually be in conversation with others and asking with intentionality, how do we do this in a centered way? I think that will help a lot.
Excellent.
And something else just came to mind. I think it's very important to recognize our strong bounded tendencies, and therefore to have a spirit of humility and confession, and be aware of, confess, sensitive to your bounded ways, my bounded ways, which will come up.
Thank you. Those are great. Yeah, four steps that we could take. Those are fantastic. I have two quick questions here at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
So to my 21-year-old self, so this is my 64-year-old self talking to my 20-year-old self. And if they're in conversation, I would acknowledge my 21-year-old self. There are some things that I think you were right about that it would be good for me to pay attention to today. So I'm not going to my 21-year-old self saying, oh, poor Mark, 21. Maybe I would start with that. But I think mostly it would be this compassionate sense of, oh, Mark, you are so passionate about these things, and appropriately so. But I would want to give that Mark, a bit more, relax. It's not all on your shoulders. Jesus loves you, and relax in that love of Jesus. So I think that would be maybe the second thing I would say. And I would read this book, Mark, go read Centered Set Church, like you need it. So it'd be good for you and others. That's
great. That's good. Anything that you've been reading lately or watching lately you could recommend?
Let's see. I just, I'm starting the semester today, and I have been, a book that I added to my ethics course this semester is Restless Devices by Felicia Wu Song. And I think she does a really good job at, on one hand, advocating for just the imperative of, we need to come up with some ways of creating some space, fasting from our devices, but going deeper and saying, what is being displaced? How does the church respond? So there's a book that I'm thinking about at the moment.
That's great. So You said go to centeredsetchurch.com. Where can people find the book? Where can people find you if they want to find you?
Okay, so you can find me, the book, the videos on centeredsetchurch.com. And I'm writing a commentary on Galatians, which hopefully will be out in around February. There's some information, a sign up thing there on that, centeredsetchurch.com. And then, the book is available at all of the normal sort of online places, bookstores. You can access it as well.
Excellent. Mark, this is a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I love the conversation. How do we orient towards the center to become more centered set and not bounded or fuzzy, which we see a lot these days. So I really enjoyed it. And it was very practical as you took some steps to say, how could we actually embody the character of Jesus? What are the characters that we have to take to be more centered? And what are some of the steps that we could take to get there? So thank you, Mark. It was really, really good.
You are welcome. And thanks for the great questions and for inviting me on. I appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you. Bye. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.